I want you to imagine something. You are standing on the deck of the largest moving object ever built by human hands. The night air is cold, colder than you expected, but perfectly still. The ocean around you is absolutely flat, black glass stretching to every horizon. Above you, the stars are blazing. No moon, just stars. More stars than you have ever seen in your life, burning so bright and so clear in the North Atlantic darkness that some passengers have already come out on deck just to look at them. The ship beneath your feet is so vast, so solid, so impossibly powerful that you can barely feel it moving. But it is moving, cutting through the black water at 22 knots, trailing a white wake that stretches back toward the horizon. You are on the RMS Titanic, and you have absolutely no idea that in a few hours you will be fighting for your life in water so cold it will feel like 1,000 knives. Nobody on this ship knows what is coming, and that is what makes this story so devastating. Not just the scale of the disaster, not just the numbers, 1,517 dead, 710 survivors, the worst peacetime maritime disaster in history. What makes the Titanic story truly unbearable is the knowledge. We know what happens. We have always known what happens. And yet, watching it unfold hour by hour, decision by decision, we find ourselves desperately hoping, against everything we know, that somehow, this time, it will end differently. It won't. But tonight, we are going to go back, hour by hour, deck by deck. We are going to follow the people, the millionaires sipping champagne in first class, the families in steerage dreaming of new lives in America, the crew members who kept their posts as the water rose around their ankles. We are going to understand exactly how this happened, exactly why it happened, and exactly what those final hours felt like for the 2,224 people on board. This is the last night of the Titanic. Let us begin at noon on the last full day of the Titanic's life. The ship has been at sea for 4 days since leaving Southampton on April 10th. She called at Shipwreck in France and Queenstown in Ireland to take on additional passengers, and has been steaming west across the North Atlantic ever since. At noon on April 14th, Captain Edward John Smith, 62 years old, one of the most experienced and respected commanders in the White Star Line, takes his daily position reading. The ship is making excellent time. The weather is perfect, the sea is calm. And then, at around noon, the first iceberg warning arrives. It comes by wireless from the SS Corona. Ice reported, position given, latitude and longitude noted. Captain Smith reads it, acknowledges it, posts it on the bridge, and the Titanic continues at full speed. This is the first in a series of decisions that, viewed from the comfortable distance of history, seem almost incomprehensible. But in 1912, they made a certain kind of sense. Icebergs were a known hazard of the North Atlantic crossing. Experienced captains had been navigating around them for decades. The standard practice was to post extra lookouts and reduce speed if ice was actually sighted, not before. The Titanic, furthermore, was on her maiden voyage. There were expectations. There was pressure, not spoken aloud perhaps, but present nonetheless, to make good time, to arrive in New York on schedule, to demonstrate what this ship could do. And so at noon on April 14, 1912, the Titanic continues west at 22 knots. While the wireless operators are receiving iceberg warnings, the world above the waterline has no idea and no interest in ice. In the first-class dining saloon, the largest room afloat, stretching the full width of the ship, the social rituals of Edwardian high society are proceeding with absolute normality. Consider the passenger list. John Jacob Astor IV, the wealthiest man on board, worth in today's terms approximately $1 billion, is traveling with his young new wife Madeline, who is 5 months pregnant. He is 47, she is 18. Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's department store, is traveling with his wife, Ida. They have been married 41 years, and as the events of tonight will demonstrate, they are entirely inseparable. Benjamin Guggenheim, mining magnate and heir to one of America's greatest fortunes, is on board with his valet and his mistress, a French singer named Leontine Aubert. Margaret Brown, later immortalized as the unsinkable Molly Brown, is traveling alone, returning from a trip to Europe. She is 54 years old, tough, practical, and entirely unimpressed by the social distinctions that define life aboard this ship. And then there is J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, the man who owns the Titanic, traveling as a passenger, occupying one of the most luxurious private suites on the ship. Ismay will survive tonight. The decisions he made, or may have made, will haunt the rest of his life. But the Titanic was not simply a floating hotel for the Edwardian super-rich. Deep in the lower decks, in the third-class steerage accommodation, there were 710 passengers whose names the newspapers would barely mention in the days following the disaster. They were immigrants predominantly, Irish families fleeing poverty, Italians seeking work, Scandinavians chasing land, and Eastern European Jews escaping persecution. For many of them, the Titanic's third-class accommodation, clean, modern, with actual cabins rather than the open dormitories of older ships, was the most comfortable voyage they had ever made. They had spent everything they had on these tickets, everything, the entirety of their savings, the proceeds of sold farms and shops and household goods. They were traveling to America with nothing but the contents of a single trunk and the absolute conviction that what waited for them on the other side was worth every sacrifice. Tonight, the third-class passengers will face an additional obstacle that the first-class passengers will not: locked gates separating the lower decks from the upper decks, and a near-total absence of crew members directing them to the lifeboats. Of the 710 third-class passengers on board the Titanic, only 174 will survive. By early evening, the iceberg warnings are increasing with frequency. At 1:42 p.m., the Baltic had warned of large quantities of field ice and icebergs. At 1:45 p.m., the America warned of 2 large icebergs. At 5:50 p.m., the Californian reported 3 large icebergs. Captain Smith adjusts the ship's course very slightly southward, a standard precautionary measure, but he does not reduce speed. At 7:30 p.m., 3 more warnings arrive from the Californian. The wireless operator, Jack Phillips, is overwhelmed with passenger traffic, the wealthy first-class passengers paying premium rates to send social telegrams to friends in New York. The ice warnings are noted and set aside. At 9:40 p.m., just 2 hours before the collision, the Mesaba sends what is perhaps the most specific and urgent warning of the entire day, reporting an enormous field of ice directly in the Titanic's path. This message never reaches the bridge. Phillips is too busy with passenger traffic. The message sits in the wireless room, unread by the officers who needed to read it most. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the first-class dining saloon is at its most brilliant. Captain Smith himself has been dining with a group of wealthy passengers, including the American socialite Margaret Thayer, but at around 9 o'clock he excuses himself and returns to the bridge. It is a calm, clear, bitterly cold night. The temperature has been dropping steadily since sunset. It is now well below freezing. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, about to hand over the watch, gives specific instructions to First Officer Murdoch about the conditions. Watch carefully for ice. The night is very dark, no moon. In these conditions, the first sign of an iceberg might be the breaking of waves at its base. Except tonight, there are no waves. The ocean is completely, eerily calm. This is paradoxically one of the factors that will contribute to the disaster. Icebergs are traditionally spotted partly by the white water breaking at their base. Tonight, the ocean is so still that there is no white water, no warning signal. The Titanic is sailing into the darkness at 22 knots, with the lookouts straining their eyes at an ocean that gives nothing away. High above the deck, in the crow's nest of the Titanic's foremast, two lookouts are sharing the 10 to midnight watch. Frederick Fleet is 24 years old. Reginald Lee is 41. They have been posted here to do one thing: watch for danger ahead. They have no binoculars. The binoculars that were supposed to be in the crow's nest had been locked away in a cabinet when the ship left Southampton, and in the confusion of the departure, the key had been left behind with a crew member who transferred off the ship at the last minute. Requests had been made for replacement binoculars. Nothing had been provided. Fleet and Lee are using their naked eyes to scan the darkness ahead. The night is extraordinary, beautiful in a way. The stars are blazing, the sea is like black silk. It is intensely, painfully cold, and somewhere ahead in that perfect darkness, there is ice. At 10